Live. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And what a treat we have today. We're really pleased to have Dean Jobb with us today. He's going to be discussing his brand new book, A Gentleman and a Thief, The Daring Jewel Heists of a Jazz Age Rogue. And it is a hell of a book. There's so much to talk about. And we're honored to have David Grann with us to conduct the program tonight. You know, David, of course, is the author of The Killers of the Flower Moon. And his brand new book is called not brand new, but his latest book is called The Wager. And it's also an amazing tale, as so many of you know. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And sorry, everybody, for starting just a few minutes fashionably late tonight, but
Well,
it's a
thank you.
delight to have you both with us.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm responsible for the tardy start. I confused my Eastern time with Canadian time. But in any case, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so honored to be here with Dean with his remarkable new book. I had the privilege of reading it in galley, found it absolutely mesmerizing. And so it'll be fun to drill down. And I thought we'd talk for maybe about 45 minutes and then open it up to any questions people may have and go from there. Um, I thought the to begin, Dean, is just to kind of ask you, this is the hardest thing I always think is trying to find the right story to tell. You seem to have a real knack for that with all your books. How did you come across this particular story?
Well, as you know, David, I mean, the hard part is finding the ideas, but also finding the ideas that have the legs and the scope and the whatever the magic secret sauce is that make it into a book. And in this case, I was coming off a bad relationship with a very odious Victorian era serial killer named Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, subject to my last book. And I was looking for a change. And I typed the words 1920s con artist into Google because it's such a great era, the Jazz Age. And con artists are roguish. They're not victimless crimes, but they sometimes are the kind of anti-hero you can root for a little bit. And my Google search yielded third or fourth hit, a reference to or a link to a Life magazine profile of Arthur Berry from 1950s, called him the greatest jewel thief who'd ever lived. And I was hooked right there. Whether or not I had a book, I wasn't sure, but there was enough of an outline in the story in the feature to tell me this was worth pursuing. And I very quickly found not only that there was enough material, but I could add to the story that there was a lot of forgotten and unknown aspects of the story. So that's how Arthur Berry and I first met.
So, for those readers who haven't yet had the privilege to read the book, and you should go out and do so, tell me a little bit about Barry, a little bit, just even what period exactly of time in history. Tell us a little bit the regions that he operated in.
So Berry was active from 1920 to 1927. In that time, pulled dozens, probably over 100 heists. I certainly was able to confirm scores of heists and netted about, in today's terms, about $60 million worth of jewelry. His main areas were Westchester County, north of Manhattan, and Long Island. And he focused on the estates and mansions of the well-to-do, places where he would expect to find jewelry. He did pull one major heist on Manhattan Island at the Plaza Hotel, and he did get as far afield as New Jersey for to Rumson, New Jersey for one of his heists, but mostly in these two areas. And I found an interesting pattern as I assembled crimes that he'd either confessed to or was suspected of. He would he would have a spree going in Nassau County on Long Island, and then when the heat was on, he'd simply disappear. And suddenly Westchester County would have a spate of similar robberies. And this went back and forth for years. It was almost like he was having this was my Long Island season, this is my Westchester season. And it was only after the fact that the authorities in these two areas realized it had been the same burglar all along.
And what kind of, the scale of these things are we talking about? Was it the fact that he did so many different places that he, became one of the greatest, like greatest is always a strange word, but one of the, one of the more notorious burglars? Or was there one particular theft that caught the world's attention?
Well, what struck me about Barry was we'll probably talk a bit about his background, but suffice it to say that in the 1920, he's in New York. He can't find a job. He served in the war and it, by all accounts, served bravely as a medic. Was even put up for a medal for bravery. And but he came back in a late wave of veterans from Europe and couldn't find a job. So he set out to find a way to make money, and he figured he'd have to turn to crime. And he even sat and rationalized it, said, I don't want to be a bank robber, I don't want to be waving guns around, I don't want accomplices. And he felt it wouldn't be polite to just mug people on the street. So he'd had some success as a juvenile delinquent, which we may get into. When he was young, he ended up in reformatory, partly for break-ins. So it was something he could do. And for your question of what maybe made him the greatest was, and what intrigued me was how I could see the progression, the mastery that he brought to his burgling, either in his planning, how he found his targets, just the skill he used to sneak in and out of houses, and especially at first, he never encountered his victims. They would be downstairs at dinner or out for the night, and that's when he would plan to break in. So I saw this real progression, and the sheer volume of thefts he was able to pull off, the sheer number, and all the while, and at times being hunted by posses of armed police on the back roads of Nassau County and Westchester County, specifically looking for this phantom burglar, but he managed to elude them all.
And how did he select his targets? Was he out there casing different houses, different neighborhoods? He kind of saw himself. He said he didn't want to, be out there mugging. Did any kind of thought go into the type of target he was selecting? Did he try to
Well,
create mythology about himself, in the way he went about this?
Well, he would target certain neighborhoods. He liked to look for large estates with lots of landscaping and shrubbery because he knew he could hide. Also, trellises, porches, ways he could get up to the second floor and break in. But then he started reading the social pages of the New York newspapers, society pages, and said they became his unwitting accomplices because they would talk about who was at their country home, who was in Palm Beach. He would know where the people were, the jewels were with them. So he would know what chances of a certain rich family, rich, renowned person being home. Also, the society pages would have pictures of socialites resplendent in their jewelry or their fine pearls, giving him ideas. And at one point, he made a lot of connections by hanging out at something called the New York Casino, which was a restaurant in Central Park. And he would go to lunch there, sit in a corner, and just watch women at lunch with their jewelry. And when he saw some good prospects, he would follow them out, see what limousine they got in. And this story was told twice. As far as I know, it's true. It seems outlandish, but he claimed that he would then take down the license number, go to the nearest phone the police station, claiming to be sergeant or patrolman, whatever, and say there'd been an accident. Could you run this plate? And no one questioned him, and they would give him the address. So suddenly he'd know who the person was, where they lived, and then he could go ahead and do his planning. But probably his most audacious method was to simply put a tux on, drive out to an estate, jump over the wall, and mingle with a garden party, and go inside and pose as a guest, chat up people, and no one questioned that he wasn't what he looked to be, which was a young rich man. And then he would find a way to sneak upstairs, figure out where jewelry was likely to be found later, maybe even unlock a couple of windows and come back later and do his crime.
And how, what were the forces when you dug into his background? You touched on a little bit, you mentioned he went to reformatory school, but tell us a little bit more when you try to, trying to explore motivation, his origin story, what led him, it's not everybody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to be a cat burglar of some sort and go into houses and be a thief. How, what were the forces that you identified that helped shape him and kind of turn him to this life of crime?
Well, one of the things that captivated me about Barry is he's so much like a real life Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief. I mean, he even said some of the same lines that are in the movie about how any woman who can wear hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry knows where her next meal's coming from, right? To rationalize why he did it. What I think readers will do, and I invite them to, is along with me try to figure out, well, is this a good man who could have taken another path, or was he just a thuggish criminal? Well, he didn't act very thuggish most of the time. And he was known for politeness. If he did break in while people were in a bedroom and they woke up, he would put them at ease and assure them he was only there for the jewelry, and even chat about how their night was going, which of course it wasn't going very well at that point. He'd violated their security. But was there a good man in here? And you do see in the book a couple of times where his life could have gone a different direction. So he's born in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's part of his working class, large Irish Catholic working class family, but always seemed destined to run with the wrong crowd. So he went from vandalism to theft to some break-ins, and it ultimately, as I said, ended up in a reformatory. But then signed up for service overseas after America entered the Great War in 1917. Became a medic, a first aid man, they were called at the time, and was shot a couple of times, was gassed, wounded himself as he was bringing wounded men off the battlefield. As I said, put up for a medal. So it almost feels like he could have gone a different path, a legit path, but then he had the misfortune of coming back in a late wave of returning veterans. So at that point, well, at any point in his life, he could have chosen a different path, but he resolved that this would be his path. And he wanted to live well. He was part of that lost generation that had survived the war, survived a major pandemic. And Barry rationalized it and said, look, he thought you got to understand why I did what I did. It was live for today. Anything goes. It was live well because, this is a generation that many of them had faced death in the war. So he wanted to live well. This would allow him to live well. And he also liked to gamble. So he would gamble away a lot of the proceeds of his robberies. And when he ran out of money, he would rob again. So he said, why not live well? And he was facing another gritty reality. He realized that he was in a dangerous profession. If the police didn't catch him, the next time he poked his head through a bedroom window, could be a gun there waiting for him. And I think that as well. I mean, he decided to live this high life, and it intrigued me that he personified his times. He became this Broadway character right out of Damon Runyon, who is gambling, living life to its fullest, and hiding hiding the fact that he's working on the other side of the law.
And did the press begin to glamorize these robberies and to glamorize this kind of phantom figure?
Absolutely. The Phantom was what he was dubbed on Long Island. He was the ladder thief who was the scourge of Westchester County. He was the dinner thief on Long Island because he started out being known for while a family was at dinner and entertaining, he would sneak upstairs when there'd be nobody there. And these were all monikers or nicknames he was given in the press. And also his the gentlemanly demeanor that he took on in some of his later and more spectacular heists where he would chit chat and try to put people at ease. And yeah, the press lapped this up. Headlines: polite burglars hit again, gentleman thief on the prowl, things like this. And certainly when he was discovered, yeah, he became a celebrity criminal.
And was there something about the forces of the 1920s in particular? There are always these different periods. You had the 1930s when certain kind of outlaws, were glamorized. Was there something about the 1920s and about him that tapped into certain sociological forces that led him to be glamorized in that period?
Well, his decision in 1920 to break the law comes months after the New York Daily News is founded, America's first tabloid on the Fleet Street model. And its focus was celebrity, crime, sensationalism. I mean, Barry ticked all the boxes. His victims were famous people. I mean, he robbed a Rockefeller, Percy Rockefeller, the nephew of JD, one of the richest men in America. He robbed Jessie Donahue, who was an heiress to the Woolworth five and dime fortune, and uh, and he even robbed Lord and Lady Mountbatten, who happened to be visiting Long Island in 1924. um, Oil tycoons, Wall Street bigwigs. So these were all major crimes. And even though Barry's name wouldn't be attached to them for years, yes, they were huge sensations in the press and a lot of pressure on the police to solve these crimes because of the stature of the victims, but also the stigma of the police being impotent and unable to stop him.
Now, as an author, there's this challenge. You're writing about somebody, this kind of gentleman criminal, that you don't glamorize a figure like this. How did you navigate that as an author? How did you view him, or how did you come to view him? And how did you kind of navigate that minefield of when you have somebody like this who has certain kind of romantic characteristics, or what we come to see as romantic, while at the same time he's breaking into houses, stealing, scaring people, and whatnot?
Well, I mean, I'll admit I like the guy, but I don't think I'd hand him the keys to my house. Okay, not that he'd need them. But well, one thing I do is I interrogate him like any other source, and I mean by that, there's a lot written about Barry decades after the fact. He gave a lot of interviews decades after the fact, 50s, 60s. And I could see sometimes why he was fudging facts at certain times. Early on, he didn't want to talk about his major heist because he was afraid of being charged with them, which made sense. He was already in prison at that point. So I could see that at various times he might tell a slightly different story. So my strategy for that is to try as much as possible to rely on what was said at the time. So, what did Barry say in 1927 when he's ultimately arrested? What did he say in 1932 when he's rearrested because there's a prison break involved here? And I'll leave the details under the heading spoiler here. But that's when it's fresh enough that the victims could challenge, the police could challenge, reporters could challenge the version of events that's coming out. So I strove to find that. And also, if there was an inconsistency, try to resolve it and see, well, what is the most plausible scenario here? So I didn't give him a free ride as much as I thought he was quite an interesting anti-hero. But it is challenging, to also hold him to the same standard, of course, as every other source you're unearthing and trying to reconcile and trying to get as close as you can to the truth of what happened.
And I don't know how much we want to go to spoilers or not, so I'll leave this to you. But did he have an Achilles heel that ultimately, did he have a flaw in the craft that ultimately led to his downfall, led him to get caught?
Well, I'll tell this much that when I set out to tell this story, I knew there was a love story in it, but I wasn't sure how much of it I could get into because I didn't know how well Anna Blake would be known at the time, what kind of a record she left. But Anna Blake comes into Barry's high-flying life in 1925. She thinks he's a salesman and he's always flush with cash, and he says he's a gambler. And he was. So he was truthful about that, except that wasn't how he made his money. That's how he lost his money. And she fell for him. She was a recent widow. She was in love. And she said to friends, I don't care what he does. It's none of my business. I want to be with him. But in 1927, Barry's arrested. Anna Blake's with him. Now, Anna Blake, there's no evidence she was an accomplice, and we have to take her word for it that she didn't know what he really did. And the record at the time, again, where I go, it's pretty clear that she was devastated when she found out when he was arrested and she found out what his real job, what his real pursuit was. And she, I wanted to know, could I tell her story? And I was fortunate to find a newspaper series she did in the 30s, so not too far removed from these events, where she talked in the first person candidly about their lives together, her life imploding when he was arrested, and she stood by him. So that was a really interesting feature of the story. And Barry, gentleman to the end, in 1927, she's arrested. You talked about his Achilles heel. Well, she was an Achilles heel, but he made his one big mistake. He gave her a ring that he'd stolen. It wasn't a necessarily overly valuable ring, but the police traced it to one of his robberies. So then they had him really jammed, and he worked out a deal. Let my wife go, let Anna Blake go, don't charge her, and I'll confess. And that's ultimately what he did. So a more gallant and gentlemanly act you couldn't, I don't think you could imagine, because he was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in prison.
You talked a little bit about finding that newspaper series. I'm curious, you might have or find a story that fascinates you, but how to actually tell it and to be able to get the material that will let you close to these people who are now passed or no longer alive.
Yeah.
What else did you find? What other documents or records did you unearth that were particularly revelatory and help you tell the story with such vivid detail as you do?
Yeah. And as you know, David, I mean, that's really, that can be the deal breaker on a book. You want readers to be absorbed in the characters, you want them to be immersed in the world. And if it's all secondhand material, I mean, you need that authentic first person voice. I was so lucky to find it with Anna Blake. With Barry, it was a matter of just digging and digging, finding everything I could. I mean, we're so lucky in this era of newspaper databases that you can find sources that would have eluded anyone who was going through microfilm or actual newspapers decades ago, through keyword searches. And I was really lucky to find. So I assembled everything I could on Barry. And really essential sources were two longer series he did with the press, telling his own story, and the volume of interviews he did at various times when he was arrested or before the courts, that really enabled me to do it. One key in this kind of research is, are there court records? And of course, in Barry's case, he confesses to one crime. That's enough to put him away. There's what happens to the rest of the material? I was hoping there might be police files in Westchester County or Nassau County. There weren't that I could find. No DA records, no trial. So that really narrowed that down. But I did find grand jury indictments in Nassau County. The one that Barry was sent to prison on, but half a dozen others that confirmed major robberies he was also implicated in. So that was a really valuable resource to find. And I was really grateful that those records still existed in at the courthouse there. As well, there were a scattering of archival records on some of his heists that helped. But it's these first-person narratives were just so important to bringing him and Anna Blake and his life vividly to the reader. Bringing his life to life is what I guess I was going to say.
And, you mentioned Cary Grant, kind of the lines in the film, seem to be influenced or almost taken from the story. Did the story kind of radiate out there? Did it influence any other kind of literature or television or popular shows, or did any other criminals model themselves after Barry? Now he's kind of a forgotten figure, but in his day he was clearly a sensation.
Well, I start the book with quotes. One's from Cary Grant's character in To Catch a Thief in 1955, and the other is Arthur Berry in 1932, and they're saying the same thing about how anyone who can afford this kind of jewelry, won't go hungry was Cary Grant's term. So I sometimes wonder if whoever wrote the screenplay for To Catch a Thief knew about Barry. But certainly some fictionalized gentleman thieves preceded Barry. I talk in the book about how Barry said he was mystified as he was reading about his crimes, and the headlines would say Raffles strikes again, American Raffles on the rampage, things like this. And he didn't know what Raffles was, so he went to the library to look up. And these are stories written about the turn of the last century by a man named Hornung, who was Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, who created this gentlemanly figure named A.J. Raffles, who's an English gentleman, a little down on his luck, so far down on his luck, and so determined not to give up his status and the lifestyle he enjoys that he turns to jewel theft. And this Raffles character became hugely popular and to the point where it became a nod in headlines. Everyone knew what they were talking about,
Except for Barry.
what the papers were talking about. At about the same time, a writer named Leblanc in France created a character that's really well known now, thanks to a Netflix series, Lupin. And Lupin is a gentleman jewel thief as well as also a bit of a crime fighter. LeBlanc added this layer, and anyone who knows the Netflix series knows that again, you've got this gentlemanly figure who uh, sort of has a heart of gold, but an exterior that's suited to crime. But Raffles, Lupin, and Barry and Cary Grant and To Catch a Thief all have one thing in common. They're not really noble criminals. They're stealing from the rich, but they're for the most part giving to themselves. And so we're not talking a Robin Hood here or anything like that. But a kind of an anti-hero, something complicated, a likable figure that turns to crime. Not victimless crime, but not as bad as violent bank robbers or, for that matter, violent jewel thieves who would just simply shoot up a jewelry store, which was very common in the 20s as it would be in other eras. So he sort of reflects a tradition both in fiction and well, he brings it into the world of fact.
And do you think, to me, it's always kind of this riddle, it's almost an everlasting fascination. You could trace it through literature, you could trace it through film, you could trace it through the newspaper, the serials, this kind of fascination with a certain kind of criminal, a certain kind of burglar, a certain kind of jewel thief. Um, I think you kind of just answered this question, but you spent so much time researching this. So did you ever get a sense of where that fascination, and which perhaps even you share, where does that fascination come from? I get, where does that, because normally we look at criminals as some people breaking the law, violating norms, pretty harsh judgments, lock them up, but not a lot of sympathy. And yet there is this character, as you described, that kind of weaves its way through literature and through books that the public has this deep fascination with. What's your sense of the cause of that?
Well, I mean, one factor is choice of victim. And again, I mean, rich people, wealthy people have the same right to be protected from crime as anyone else. But, there's something about jewelry. I thought of this as writing the book. It's really the ultimate expression of obscene wealth. I mean, if I mean, really expensive jewelry, you can have a huge mansion, but you can still live in it. You can have hundreds to $300,000 sports car, but you can still drive it. But jewelry only serves one function. It's to flaunt and show off. And so you do see that in the press coverage, and certainly the intense interest in sort of the travails of the ultra rich, that they have to put up with this burglar. I wouldn't say he becomes a folk hero, and these aren't victimless crimes, but his choice of victim means that maybe there wouldn't be the same sympathy. And also the fact that he he avoided violence. He would carry a gun. He always swore it was just for control. He wouldn't use it. He never did. He never used it. He never physically hurt any of his victims. I mean, there was the mental anguish of someone breaking into, violating the sanctity of their homes. I don't minimize that. But the fact that he didn't hurt anyone, and in fact, some of his victims actually later praised what a gentleman he'd been. And again, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, one socialite, Dorothea Livermore, actually started negotiating with him to get back rings that she said had sentimental value, and Barry gave them back. They were worth tens of thousands of dollars. And she said later, when the press asked, well, what do you think of him? She said, well, I know he's terrible, but isn't he charming? So it really gives a sense of, again, that uh, the sort of demeanor he brought to it. I think that could explain some of the public sympathy, but I wouldn't minimize the fact that he's stealing from the rich.
So I want to make sure there's time for questions, but before we do the questions, I'll ask you that dreaded question. It's the question I hate most when I'm out giving a talk about the book I just finished that took years of my life, and people say, well, what's next? And so feel free to throw a book at the screen at me or say nothing, but are you looking? Have you found? You seem like the type who always has a file or something lined up, but in any case, what's next?
Well, it's a question I would always dread too, and I don't have a book to throw at you, but I will soon, or in a couple of years. Just as I finished the project and I was waiting for, the time in between, through the editing process and the getting towards publication, I started working up another idea, and it's been accepted. So my next book for Algonquin and HarperCollins Canada is called Murder in the Cards, and it's about the 1920 murder of a bridge game expert named Joseph Elwell in New York City, and it's never been solved. And it's suspect rich, everything from millionaires to underworld figures to racetrack gamblers to Palm Beach socialites, and a string of women that were in his orbit. So it's just it just illuminates an earlier period at the cusp of the Jazz Age in 1920. And the fact this crime has never been solved is quite intriguing. I've done enough research to think that it's my challenge to suggest the most plausible outcome. And I think I've already hit on the most plausible, but I'm going to invite, there's great narrative. lots of memoirs written by key figures. There's lots on Elwell. He literally wrote the book on Bridge, Elwell on Bridge. So he was a huge celebrity and a very rich man who befriended Vanderbilts and others. So it's got this great Jazz Age backdrop. But one of the most intriguing things for me is that within a couple of years, his crime became the basis for a crime novel that actually launched the career of an American crime writer named S.S. Van Dyne, and he created a figure named Philo Vance. And the first novel he wrote with this character is based on the Elwell murder. So there's going to be an interesting interplay between fact and fiction, but also just the police investigation. And it was a huge story in the press, front page, even in the New York Times, for week after week. And the question of who shot Joe Elwell has been fascinating writers and bloggers and now podcasters for a century. So it's I think it's going to be a very interesting ride, and I'm looking forward to it.
Sounds incredibly rich, and I know that if anybody can crack the case, it will be. So why don't we open it up to if there's questions? So
Yeah,
and
absolutely. I'll jump in. Um, David, you asked a really interesting question a little while ago about the enduring appeal of these characters, of this type of character. And maybe a question for both of you, which is they seem to possess this very specialized skill set that, is just not something that the mainstream public has access to. I'm thinking about safe crackers, and there's this sort of arcane art that they all master. And do you think that might be part of the appeal, is uh, sort of this very specialized skill set?
Ian, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, it was one of the things that intrigued me about Barry is he's called the greatest jewel thief in history by Life magazine in the 50s. Well, is that true? And one thing I found is I could see how he developed, how he got better at it. We talked about a few of his innovations or methods or tactics he devised. I really only touched on some of them, but I really that drew me to him. The fact that he didn't just set out to become a burglar. He set out to become really good at it. And the fact that with a lot of police on his and private detectives on his trail, that he kept this up for 7 years, evading the police. So yeah, I was drawn to that. I mean, and Barry even said later, he would come to rue the day he did this because he paid his price, that's for sure. Lost a lot of years, lost the love of his life. And he said later, I was a smart man. I could have cleaned up on Wall Street, could have gone into business, but he chose this life. So he was an entrepreneur, but on the wrong side of the law.
Right.
Story that's the closest figure I ever wrote about to Barry was a man named Forrest Tucker. I wrote a story called Old Man and the Gun. They later made it into a movie, and Robert Redford played Forrest Tucker. And he was a man who, had robbed banks all his life. Similarly, modeled himself after this notion of being kind of a gentleman robber. Carried a gun but never used it. And I think when I wrote about it, the police had a fascination with him, even about his arcane mastery of what he did. For example, he was still robbing banks into his 70s. He used to go into a bank with a hearing aid, and the hearing aid was actually a police scanner, so he could hear if the alarm had been triggered. So I do think, whenever you write about anyone, no matter what, on any side of the law, there is, I think, an interest in the subculture in which they come from and the professions in which they come from. And in this case, yes, it's definitely a profession that most of us, thankfully, don't know anything about.
And then David, as you know, I referenced Tucker because he was such a wonderful, more contemporary version of Barry, and also Butch Cassidy. The idea that look, we just want the money. Right? And and also Tucker's perfectionism and obsession and his drive, and very much like Barry.
And
We were
interesting.
discussing.
Yeah,
I'm
Forrest
sorry.
really would model himself. So this interesting interplay between fiction and reality, I find very interesting. And Dean touched on that both in his current book and his new book. And you see how people themselves are influenced by these fictional portrayals, and they often model themselves after people who are kind of, you know, these fictional creation, these kind of romantic figures. And Forrest was certainly one like that.
Well, in that era, of the teens and the 20s, you think of the Hearst style journalism that was coming out, and also, this is obviously quite a ways before television, and all the penny dreadfuls and the pulp magazines and the true crime, these tales were perfect for that market to be romanticized. Um, Fascinating.
Yeah, that's you raise a great point because I mean we're in a true crime moment. True crime is huge,
Yes.
obviously, but if you don't have to do a lot of historical research, even looking directly for true crime like I do, to see the obsession in the past. And so it's not just the New York Daily News as a tabloid. Barry was front page news in the New York Times. There was just an insatiable public out there that wanted to know about criminals, and the press served them up.
And while he might not have been a folk hero per se, I mean, there was such poetry to to the sheer audacity of a lot of his heists, which Dean goes into in the book. And folks, you're in for a real treat. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's just poetry to a lot of his heists, and I think maybe the public, while they may have secretly been rooting for him, you know. Um, but a quick couple of quick questions. His early life in the book, and this isn't really a spoiler, but I understand that, or I read that he ferried nitroglycerin to safe crackers. What a great detail.
Well, yeah, Barry talked about that in a couple of interviews when he was asked about his past or his origins. And one thing he would not talk about was his criminal record as a young man. And a reporter in the 30s ferreted that out, and then I confirmed it with my research with the Worcester newspapers. But Barry said his biggest downfall was he was large for his age. He wasn't an overly tall man, but he was when he was a teenager compared to his peers. And that meant he got in with older kids and started running with a bad crowd. And then he came into the orbit of a man named Lowell Jack, who was a retired safecracker. And in his retirement, he made nitroglycerin, which he then distributed to safecrackers around New England. And the recipe for this, don't try this at home, but apparently you put dynamite in a pot of boiling water, and the nitroglycerin will ooze out. And so he was putting this in bottles and then stuffing a suitcase with cotton and putting the bottle inside. And Barry's job was to take it on a train to New Haven or Albany or wherever these safecrackers were. And there's a great scene Barry recalls that when he first job he does, his mentor hands him the suitcase and says, "So, be careful with this. You know, uh, try it. Don't bump into anyone." And then he sort of thinks for a second and says, "And try not to drop it," because that would be the end.
Absolutely. And there's also this wonderful lexicon of period underworld slang. I'm sure you both have copies of the Partridge's books on underworld slang, and there's just this wonderful language that's forgotten that you do such a great job of bringing back.
Oh, terms like give money the air or and a
Right.
plunger. I was so grateful I found a journalist actually explaining what a plunger was. I mean, it's literally what it sounds like, someone who plunges into to Wall Street, someone who plunges into the nightlife of Broadway. And yeah, so Barry was a plunger
He was a second story man,
and a second story man
second
too.
story
That's right.
man.
I
And
remember, I remember coming across a reference on the nitroglycerin. The people would use it for the safe cracking to blow up the safes. They were sometimes referred to as the soup men because they would bring the liquid.
right.
And one fascinating slang was Yeggmen, Yeggg. And this was a safecracker. And, in the teens and in the 19 teens and 20s, you'd see that Yeg and Yeggman everywhere. I mentioned it in the book, but there's a term that's disappeared, I guess, gone along with safecracker, but its origins, I don't know.
It is so interesting how, a character like Barry, you wonder, is he a product of a time and a place, with that just the opulence of the 1920s and that whole jazz era. And David mentioned, the 30s coming up, that ushers in a very different period with Prohibition and, the gangster, the Dillinger Capone kind of a whole new generation of criminals. Um, yeah, it's just fascinating. Let's get to some, sorry to hog the questions here. I just found the whole thing so interesting. And along the way, you get to talk about some really interesting sort of side subjects, such as prison conditions during the era. What was that research like?
Well, Barry was in three prisons. He started in Sing Sing, ended up in Auburn, ended up breaking out of Auburn, living as a fugitive for a few years, and he ultimately ended up in Attica. So I knew I'd have to find a lot about prison conditions and also find his records, because that's a lot of years of his life that I didn't want to just gloss over. And I also wanted people to get a sense of what he endured, not because he didn't deserve it, because I mean, yeah, he broke the law, but prison conditions when he started in the late 20s and early 30s were throwbacks to the Victorian era. I mean, Dickensian. And small, narrow 3.5 foot wide stone-lined cells that were described as stone coffins, and very aptly. Um, I was really lucky in that I was writing this book during the pandemic, so my ability to travel was limited. But I contacted the New York State Archives, and they have the prison records, and online I could see what boxes or record groups would have prisoner records from the time Barry was there. None of them indexed, but I figured there had to be the material. And they very graciously picked away at it over numerous months and just unearthed gold for me, sent me hundreds of pages of material. I mean, I was willing to hire a researcher, and they said they would do it. And sort of one of the motherlode nuggets that I found was Barry's mugshot from 1932. None of this material had been seen. And that was really good as well because it confirmed a lot of things Barry said about his time in prison. For instance, he said he spent 5 years in solitary as punishment for breaking out. And I thought, can that be true? The records confirm it. The intake date and then the leaving date, it's all there. And these records plus news accounts of what other prisoners were going through, as well as any reference I could find to Barry in those times, really helped me recreate what his life was like.
So some questions have come in that are very interesting. Russ asks, he says, I understand that when you spoke at a bookstore in Newton, Mass, there was a guest in the audience who met Arthur Barry. Can you relay that conversation?
Someone has very good sources. Yes. A man named Kevin came up to me and his sister. Oh gosh, her name's just anyway, brother and sister piped up and said they knew Arthur Barry, and which was incredible. And so they didn't live far away in Massachusetts from Newton, where the store was. And they, as teenagers, had attended military reunions with their father, who'd fought in World War II, and he was in the 4th Division. And so was Barry in an earlier war. And some World War One veterans came to these reunions. Barry was one of them. They befriended him and then later found out some of the story. So actually, I'm following up with them in the next few days to get some of their reminiscences because I didn't know this. I did speak to some family members, but it was just incredible to meet them. And Kevin did confirm that Barry was charming.
Okay, here's a question I think that a lot of people would like to know, which is how did he fence all the jewelry that or is that too much of a spoiler to really get into?
No, not at all. But I just want to say, don't try this at home if that's why you're interested. No, it's a legitimate question. And it should be pointed out that when I say Barry stole $60 million, that's the face value of the jewelry. He would typically get 10%. Still a lot of money. He's raking in today almost $1 million a year. But he said there was a network of fences. He even claimed this obviously isn't literally true, but he said you could fence the Statue of Liberty in the 20s. There were so many fences. And New York was the center of the worldwide jewel trade at that time because of the war had sort of knocked Antwerp and Amsterdam back. And so there was a market for untraceable jewels, and all he had to do was pry diamonds and emeralds and other stones from their settings and sell the raw stones, which would be untraceable. And someone should do a treasure hunt in the Hudson River somewhere. I don't know if we'd ever locate it, but Barry said he would dump the settings, the gold, which would be valuable in itself, but of course could easily be traced to the robberies. He would just dump that in the Hudson.
We had a gentleman last night, an author named Matthew Hart. You may know his stuff. He's written a really terrific series about modern day jewel heists and things like that. His latest book's called The Lucifer Cut, and and he was talking a little bit about, oftentimes when it's a big diamond, they'll break it down into smaller pieces and fence it that way. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let's see.
Barry did say he did have one problem. He had such a volume of jewelry that at times he did find it hard to find a fence because nobody had the cash. So he became a bit of a victim of his own success at times, but he did manage to unload his loot.
Let's see. Okay, yeah, and this is also possibly a little bit of a spoiler. He was accused of, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, of course, was a massive story, and and he was accused of that, and but he had a code, and he protested that bitterly.
Well, this is an intriguing part of the story. I've alluded to the fact that Barry does spend a few years on the lam, escape from prison, and the Lindbergh kidnapping happens in 32 while he's at large, and a private detective named Val Farrell of rather dubious ethics is retained by the New York Daily News to be sort of their in-house expert on detection, which involves basically saying the New Jersey police and FBI or the Bureau of Investigation in those days don't know what they're doing. But he also knew Barry. He'd had a role in Barry's arrest. So he, out of the blue, wrote a column saying, "Well, if you're looking for possible suspects, here's a guy who used ladders to get to second-story windows and could get in and out without being detected, which is what happened in the Lindbergh case. Well, maybe it's Barry." Well, he went further. He said it was Barry. Now, Barry had never kidnapped a child and would later be adamant that he didn't. And it very quickly went from a kidnapping to a murder once the baby's body was found. But yes, and it was one of those sort of incredible, can this be true? Was Barry really a serious suspect? And David had asked earlier about key key records, and one was the Lindbergh case records. There's a huge archive of them. There's such interest in that case to this day. And I was able to find and get access to through the archives in Trenton of the state police, the actual reports that were done at the time of Barry's being detained, and the investigation they did to find out whether he indeed was the kidnapper, which is what the press were trying to make people believe, and he was ultimately exonerated.
And then the great crime reporter, what was her name? Grace Robinson. There's a
Yeah.
section in the book where she interviewed him as
Yes,
well.
and David, you might agree with this. When it's almost a century prior and you can't talk to anyone, what a great gift it is to have Grace Robinson, who was a fearless reporter, crime reporter for the Daily News, interrogating Barry, and in real time as she's interviewing him, saying he says this, but the record says that. He says this, but I found this. In other words, she's poking away to get to the truth on the writer's behalf. So it's wonderful. And there's a great picture of her with Barry doing the interviews, but she ultimately did a deep dive into his life, and a very thorough questioning of his claims that again gives me more confidence that okay, this story, there's verification for this story. Thank you, Grace.
Well, I know we're getting out of time. We started a little bit late, but gosh, I'm desperate to ask David a whole bunch of questions, but I know we don't have time for it. But one question I'd love to ask, if you'll indulge me, David, is at the end of the Killers of the Flower Moon, you kind of mentioned all these revelations that had come to light in the researching of the book, and how you had just really scratched the surface of the extent of these crimes. Since that book's publication, I'm sure there's been a lot of more that's come out. Is that true?
Yeah, certainly. Since the book has come out, even from hearing from descendants, other um, people from that time period reporting suspicious deaths in their family. The challenge is, and which I try to document at the end of the book, that while the official death toll was about 27, the actual death toll was far more, and that this really was a culture of killing, and there really was this great complicity at so many levels of society. But the problem is, even when you look at many of these cases today, the suspects are deceased, the eyewitnesses are deceased, and so many of these crimes were not documented. You didn't have grace of looking at these cases at the time.
Mm.
And so, in many ways, the perpetrators had erased not only their victims' lives, but also in many cases their history. And that's one of the great horrors and tragedies of what took place.
Right. Now, you asked Dean what he's working on next. I think the whole world wants to know, what's David working on next.
I'm very cryptic about mine. It is beginning. I think my messy office. It's not too messy yet. There's some folders on the floor, and I'm a bit cryptic about it. But it's in the world of espionage and deals with many of the similar themes of searching for the truth that were part of the wager and also part of Killers of the Flower Moon.
Okay. Um, Maybe a last question for both of you. So you're both such wonderful writers, and you manage to, they have this kind of genre they call narrative nonfiction. You manage to, organize your material and tell your story uh, in a way that's always compelling, and isn't a dry, how do you do that? How do you gather all this research material, find a narrative thread that you want to tell, and how do you do it, guys? How do you give us a hint into the under the hood?
David, will the Narrative Nonfiction Union allow us to divulge that secret, or? Well, I teach at an MA graduate program something called creative nonfiction, which is the same thing. Sometimes people wonder if what the creative means, but it's not licensed to make up. It's the storytelling you're talking about, Patrick. It's looking beyond the dry facts and looking for story, looking for characters, looking for atmosphere, description, but all faithful to the facts. Not the cardinal rule is you don't make anything up. So, which is why we have to do so much research because we have anything we use, we have to find. But it's that storytelling and it's that thinking like a novelist, but with real material, thinking about scene, about character, about narrative arc, about uh, cliffhangers that will keep the reader going. Anyway, that from my side, I mean, that's really what I think is some of the magic that seems is just thinking about story first and looking for action, drama, things that will drive the narrative, and doing a ton of research, and then having the wherewithal to leave most of it out of the book.
A lot of fiction writers are always thinking about conflict, 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 Um, David, you're up.
Yeah.
I think you answered that really well. I mean, I think the secret really is the research because that is the foundation on which everything you do. You are not imagining a story, you are excavating a story. And so you need to find out where the story lies. You're trying to get as close to people's consciousness, but unlike fiction, you can't enter their consciousness. And so you are relying on these documents and corroboration. And then I think the part of the secret is to find the people who you're going to follow through the story and to try to let the story unfold as they experienced it, to let history unfold through the eyes of the people, not just with hindsight looking back where everything is obvious. The truth is, you talk about conflict and tension. The tension is when you are alive, the way we are now, or the way we are telling these stories, whether you're on a ship going around the world that is about to be shipwrecked on a desolate island, they didn't know literally within every hour what was going to happen. And in their case, their lives were often at stake. And so there's such inherent tension in that. So if you let the story unfold the way it really occurred, the way that people really experienced it with the smell of the sea and the salt or whatever it may be, um, uh, I think that's the way you distill a story, and I think that's the way you can feel a story. That's the way a story can really come alive and shake you sometimes.
You're tapping into universals that that we all share. Do you ever, both of you, do you ever, and I swear this will be my last question. Do you ever struggle with, okay, it's like I got this wonderful material. There's a book here definitely, but where's my in? Where's my in terms of how to tell the story? And then all of a sudden you go, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. You discover something some human detail that gives you the entry into the story that you were looking for. Is that accurate?
I think you're always struggling to find a way to tell a story. I'll just give you a very concrete example with Killers of the Flower Moon. I was so kind of paralyzed for a long period of time about this history, about these crimes that took place in the 1920s, where members of the Osage Nation were being serially murdered for their oil money. And I really didn't know how to tell the story because there were so many victims, there were so many different investigators, it spanned so much time. I didn't know how to tell the story and what the threads would be to the point where I don't want to say I almost abandoned it, but I was just completely paralyzed. And I always say that reading can sometimes provide your spark and your inspiration. And I happen to be reading, which is a long story, which I won't get into, Absalom by Faulkner. very hard novel to read. I don't know if I still even understand it, but I was determined to try to read it, and I was reading it. And suddenly it was about 11 at night. I bolted upright and I said, he's telling this novel from three different perspectives, and it's all about the elliptical nature of history. And I said, that's the way I'll do it. I'll tell this book from three different perspectives, and that's the way we'll get closer to the truth and history. So that spark, that serendipity, it could just happen in the completely unanticipated way. So my chore of trying to, well, I shouldn't call it a chore, but it was very hard to read Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, ended up giving me the spark and breakthrough that let me tell and come up with a narrative structure for Killers of the Flower Moon.
Was there something similar for The Wager where you said, all right, this is how I'm going to tell this story?
The Wager was, in some ways, the material forced the answer upon me, which is there was very conflicting versions of the truth. I was writing about the 18th century, and I had no way, I kind of had a set version of accounts, and I had no way to interrogate people. I couldn't ask them questions. I couldn't ask other people on the ship what had happened. So I was kind of stuck with these competing versions of the truth. And I thought, I can't play God. I don't know what happened exactly. And so the material actually determined the structure, which was I'll have to tell it from these three competing perspectives of three individuals and let the truth come out by showing how they're each shaping their story. They're each trying to emerge as the history. How do they buttress what happened? How do they edit out what happened? And so in a way, that one was less a moment than I just looked at the material and I said, there's no way to tell the story but this way. This has got to be the way.
And I think, Patrick, it goes to what I said about, does a story have the jelly, have that extra ingredient you need to make it a book? And yeah, it needs that kind of structure, and that can be hard to find. And um, like David, I think probably the best way to find it is to think about something else and just let things marinate a bit in your head. This new book, The Unsolved Murder, I hadn't tackled very many unsolved murders except in shorter stories. And one of the questions was, how am I going to tell it? And so took the dog for a walk around the block, and my wife, Cary, telling her, how do I tell this story? And she said, well, isn't it kind of a real life murder mystery? And that was it. I thought, yes, that's how I'll tell the story. I'll make it like you're reading Christie or one of these golden age as much as I can, that you come along, you see the same suspects in real time. You'll be making your own decisions about who seems to be shady or what their motives might be or whether they're the killer. So it's the same kind of thing, yeah. But that is that's the $1 million question every time. How do you find that vehicle that will allow you to tell the story?
Well, this has been a fascinating hour, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And again, Dean Jobb, his brand new book that we've been discussing, A Gentleman and a Thief. Wonderful book. And David Grann's most recent book, of course, is The Wager, still on the New York Times bestseller list. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for tuning in this evening. Have a great evening, guys.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very